Now, let's first see the agenda for today and how we're going to spend the next 2 hours. If I can get my slides to work, that's great. So, after the introduction, we're going to actually have 3 rounds of sharing and learning on emerging good practices connected to integrated territorial development. And each session is going to consist from a brief presentation and then a Q&A session. So please listen carefully and be ready with questions, because we do hope that we're going to have a very interactive dialogue today. After these 3 rounds, we will have an interactive session on how to shape case studies on the final report, so key aspects that you would like to know more or read more about. So we make sure that the final results of this ongoing work, which I'm going to introduce a bit later, are as relevant for UICT practitioners as possible. And of course, then just a brief introduction of next steps and conclusions. You're going to, yeah, let me just maybe get to the next slide. So it's important also to note the context of the event today, as it is part of the capitalization activity on good practices for integrated approach in UIA projects, which is carried out by the UIA Permanent Secretariat, ADEL, and Utopian team. Let me just briefly say hi to our team. So Peter Ramsden, Lucia Princikova, Daniella Patti, and Levente Polyak, who you're going to hear from a bit later. WebEx maybe is not the most friendly platform. So just a few tips and tricks for digital etiquette. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentations, but unmute, of course, when for the Q&A session. Use chat to ask questions, so we can maybe cluster them and see common points, so we can have an interesting discussion. And we are going to also use Slido for the event. If you're using the WebEx app, it will be embedded and it works a bit better. If not, you might not see it. So for that, we have a sort of plan B and plan C, as it is always required with innovative practices. You're going to have a QR code that takes you directly to the link on the browser, or you can just start opening Slido on your browser, or actually in the app if you have already installed it. And you will get there the event code a bit later on, so you'll be able to access it. But hopefully it will work with plan A, which is actually to be able to see it on WebEx. But before we worry about any technical issues with Slido, let me turn to Kathleen to tell us more about why today's talk is actually important.
Thank you, Anamaria. I'm really happy to see so many of you today, and I would really like to thank you for your presence on behalf of the whole UIA team. So I just wanted to give you a bit the bigger picture of why we are here today and why we decided to work on integrated development. So we started to talk about this idea to work on the topic at the end of 2020, which is also when we approved our knowledge management strategy. So this strategy was developed to ensure that we capture and promote the knowledge from UIA projects, so from your project, because here in the audience today, it's mostly, it's only UIA and URBACT cities, and that we share these learnings with other cities. So there are 3 objectives to this strategy. The first one is to capture the knowledge generated by projects during the implementation. The second, to capture and disseminate the knowledge on specific policy areas or operational challenges. And the third one is to make the knowledge more accessible for urban practitioners in Europe. So you can find all the content that we developed as part of our knowledge activities. So on housing, mobility, monitoring and evaluation, etc. in the Knowledge Lab online. I will share the link in the chat just after that. And so this activity on integrated territorial development falls into the second objective of this strategy, which is to capture the knowledge generated by projects on the operational challenge that is integrated development. And the learnings of this study will be really important for the next programming period. So you have certainly heard about this new policy objective 5 from the new CPR that lays down the provisions for the future European Regional Development Funds, among other funds. So this new PO5 is called, I'll read the title, A Europe Closer to Citizen by Fostering the Sustainable and Integrated Development of All Types of Territories and Local Initiatives. So therefore, future European programs will have the possibility to select this policy objective as part of their strategy and to fund integrated projects. But it's true to say that the concept of integrated development can be a bit vague and conceptual. So this is why we started to think about this study, to propose tangible examples of what it can mean in real life, to be able to illustrate the principles of integrated development by key examples of what our UIA projects were able to implement. And also possibly to inspire other cities and other projects for this new programming period. So I think that's it for me. I'm looking forward to the event and looking forward also to hear your comments and questions. I give the floor back to Anamaria now.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Indeed, it's really good timing for the event to learn from what has been already implemented, and also very good timing because most cities and managing authorities are preparing for the next programming period. So in a way, this is why the objectives of today's event are actually to increase awareness on principles of integrated territorial development and how they translated in UIA projects that have been so far implemented, as well as to collect feedback on aspects that should be further emphasized in the case studies and future final publication. Now, this event is specially designed for city practitioners and especially for URBACT and UIA cities, and it's so nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience. So just we're launching just a brief Slido to get a sense of who is in the room. So from where you are connecting, so from which country are you connecting with us today? So hopefully you would be able to see already the Slido on the WebEx app, or if not, just scan the QR code or introduce the very complicated number in the browser or app. So we have 11 answers so far. It was a big decision whether we should ask about countries or cities, but it might have been a very complicated icebreaker. So I see we have about 36 answers. I think that's a good start. And in case it doesn't work, you can also just let us know in the chat from where you are connecting. So wait, you already can see the answers. Why can't I do that? Maybe 30 more seconds and we can close the first question.
Well, Anamaria, if you can't see the answer, I think I can tell you that we have, I think, the majority of people from France, closely followed by people from Spain.
Indeed. And the reason that I couldn't see the answers was that I didn't answer myself. So apparently WebEx is very efficient in detecting that. Yeah.
Perfect.
I also see a lot of people from Belgium. I mean, Belgium is a bit higher, Italy, Netherlands, Croatia. I'm also in Croatia myself today, so that's nice to see. Scotland, yes, a separate country. Nice. Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see that we actually have a good balance, a good geographical balance. We're going to talk about that quite soon. So now that we get a sense of who is in the room or from where they are connecting, let's get a bit of a sense how this event is linked to the study that we are mentioning. As Kathleen briefly introduced, our big overall work this year is actually on developing the study on good practices for ITD, Integrated Territorial Development in UIA projects. And the study actually aims to understand how did UIA projects actually translate this into practice, the integrated territorial development, and what did it mean at local level? So what kind of governance arrangements and also thematic arrangements needed to be done in order to accommodate such practice? And of course, what was the impact of projects that managed to do so? Also, the development part of the study is structured in a few key milestones. Last year, we started the work in September with an inception report, finalized research questions, and also milestones for the study, and to create the advisory board. In following that, we reviewed actually all 89 funded UIA projects through the available documents from the UIA Permanent Secretariat, as well as thematic peer reviews with UIA Permanent Secretariat. And we ended up with a short list of 12 projects that could be considered as good practices. I'm very happy to see many of the cities that we interviewed for the as part of the hearings with the 12 shortlisted projects. So welcome. And now we begin two sides of the work. On the one side, we actually begin to take the information from the hearings and from the desk review and develop both case studies, which actually focus a bit more specific on a certain aspect of the project. And second, the report that is comprising all the experiences of UIA projects and bringing evidence on how the integrated territorial development approach was translated. So this is one track, so the development, and the second track is actually this type of events. We have 3 planned. This is the first one. This is more also a small consultation and feedback on initial, not necessarily findings, but initial threads that we see in our work. While the second and third event are going to be planned for the fall, and are more or less going to be a dissemination of the work. So this is actually a very good time in our work when we just finalized 12 hearings with the cities. and we are able to put together a few initial learnings that are emerging. Now, wait. Now, before we begin, because of course you're going to be curious which are the 12 selected projects, I'm going to briefly tell you about what criteria we used in order to score all the 89 projects and which projects were selected. And then we're going to jump to the learning and sharing part. So this is the time to please write us in the chat if you have any concerns or questions so far. So we will be able a bit to address them before we move into the content part. So use the chat, write questions. Now, the scorecard criteria. We actually looked at this nine criteria that in a way translate this overarching concept of integrated territorial development. I'm not defining it because we're going to do that in the second part of our conversation. So we actually looked whether the partnership of UIA projects was broad and balanced on the territorial scale, whether it was clearly defined and appropriate to the policy challenge they were addressing, how was user and citizen engagement done, more in the sense of empowerment, not just as consultation or tokenistic. If the project was relating clearly to two or more policies, and if it was combining, of course, two out of the three core pillars of sustainability, so economic, social, and environmental policy areas. We also looked at flexibility to challenges, how the added value was measured, and of course a link with the Article 7 from Stratport. Now, the 12 projects that scored high from this criteria, both from the desk review and the peer review, are actually the ones that you see here. And it's very nice to have some city representatives from some of the projects here in the audience today. We're going to cover examples from some of them today, while for most of them, we're going to cover them in the later events in the fall. Okay, so if there are no urgent question, we're going, because we know that these introductions are a bit heavy because we work with concepts, with a lot of concepts. So instead of defining all of these big buzzwords that translate in different ways in our practice, we would like to ask you what you find challenging in defining territorial integrated development. So please just write your answer on Slido, and that would be very useful for us to understand and to link it to the presentations that are going to follow. For example, in most of our talks, when we had the hearings, we were having a lot of talk around the word territorial and how it was linked to place-based. And of course, if we were talking with urban planners or urban designers, place-based had a very different connotation or translation into practice than the one if we would be talking with sociologists. So that was very interesting also to observe. And integration, of course, was something that was quite interesting to see at local level how that was being translated, and also especially on very different governance structures on how that was possible. A lot of interesting content coming up, and we look forward to putting it together in a form that is going to be most useful for many of you soon.
So, Anamaria, are you able to see the answers of the participants, or would you like me to read them? for you?
I need to answer something, so I will. And now I'm going to be able to see. Aha, yes, now, yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, so some key things emerging is various functions overlapping in a territory that is challenging. Good point. I think that is going to be very useful for our next presentation on the place-based principle. Yes, many elements to take into consideration. I think, Peter, this would be for you for cross-sectoral. Transferability in our case from Utrecht Plan Einstein. So so the part of upscaling and transferability and how that can actually be integrated from the start in an integrated approach involving all groups. A lack of knowledge from the municipality officers. Indeed, this is a very key point on capacity of urban authorities. Thank you for mentioning that. The political setups, so the political boundaries. Reversing inertias to work in cross-sectorial borders. Yes, indeed. I mean, when the system is actually still formed in silos, of course, we saw a lot of evidence of the innovative projects breaking that, but it was mostly because of a very talented team or a certain momentum that happened locally, and it was not the rule, it was just an exception. So that would be useful to comment also maybe in the cross-sectorial. Translating theory into practice, yeah, I hope that some of the talks that we're going to have are going to offer some perspective of that. And of course, the definition of the term integrated, indeed. And we have another point on why this is challenging to define, because it's not clearly defined in EU documents and regulations, and not even in the Leipzig Charter. And indeed, the GRC handbook made very good progress. Yeah, so maybe we can also comment a bit on that when we introduce the, let's say, definitions of the following part. Thank you very much. This is very useful to know and to sort of ground the conversations that are going to follow. So I think now we are, after this brief introduction, and also understanding a bit what you find challenging about defining the integrated territorial development, I think it's time to jump into the second part of our talk today, the learning and sharing, which is going to be structured, as I mentioned, in 3 rounds, taking the 3 main pillars, let's say, of integrated territorial development, which are not siloed. Of course, they're linked to the overall principle. But for the sake a bit of a thematic focus, I think it's easier to understand if we take it pillar by pillar. So the first pillar that we're going to talk about together with Daniella Patti is going to be on place-based approaches. So Dani, over to you.
Thanks, Anamaria. Thank you all. Good morning to everybody. Very, very happy to be with you. Despite being online, hopefully soon things will get better and we will be able to also have these moments of sharing also in presence, which is also nice to exchange. So in the meantime, given the infrastructure that we have with WebEx, please feel free to write comments and questions in the chat, because, you know, we try in real life, this is why I'm saying it would be easier to make it a bit more interactive, see you in the eyes and see if you're looking a bit concerned about something that we're saying or not. But in the meantime, just write in. So the first thing that we will be looking into today is the place-based approach. And I would ask to go to the next slide. Fantastic, thank you. What do we mean by place-based approach? So over the last year, there's been tons of different documents coming from the EU trying to define place-based from different points of view. But the most recent official one would be coming from the Leipzig Charter, but obviously I'm sure you also have a definition of your own in your practice, and I think that's probably also something that in reality then comes to being the most effective. So feel free also to write down in the chat your own definition of place-based, if you like. But what we consider about this is a way of being able to integrate the different scales of intervening on a development together with the local communities. So the place-based approach is not only a matter of physical and territorial, but it is also about the human dynamics that are taking place in a given area, in a neighborhood, in a city, in a region. And this is particularly relevant in order to be able to create transformation of the territory that takes into account what are the inequalities and aims at reducing them. And this is particularly relevant if we start looking into the fact that obviously this has different levels that affect, and we will discuss this also with as Anamaria said, these are not separate silos, these are interconnected. So obviously what we're talking about, having a given space working in the community, has also interconnections with governance mechanisms, with participatory methods, and also with working with different sectors from the public administration. So I will try to take control of the slides and we see if this works. And what we try to do in the work that we would like to thank, some of you I see are here. So we say hello, but we would like to thank all the cities that also took part in the interviews that we carried out over the last months, because we really took the time to discuss not only with the coordinators of the project, but also with many of the partners, with some of the local stakeholders, to really understand what was the process. Some of the projects are finished, some are still halfway through, and especially with COVID have had a lot of changes in between. So this is looking into the process of the project has been particularly relevant for us to really understand what happens, what does it actually mean, aside of the definition that come from all these important European documents. What does it actually mean on the ground when we're working in a city, just like you are doing, in developing an innovative project? What does it mean to be place-based? So we've divided the process into three main phases. The one of co-design, which we define as basically the application phase. Way too short, and I think probably some of you will agree, way too short to be able to put together all the complexity that is in a territory if you haven't really been working before. And one of the issues that we've seen there is that it's really a challenge to identify what is the right scale to really be intervening on when you want to address urban poverty, when you want to address digital transition, migrant inclusion, sustainable mobility, or any of the topics that you are working on. And in fact, one other thing, if we'd be curious to know, is of the cities that you're working on, what are the topics that you're addressing? Because obviously in this discussion now, we're talking about a more methodological approach. We'd be very curious to understand this methodology. How do you see it directly connected to what is the project that you're developing in your own city? The second phase, obviously, which is the longest and the most complex, is the implementation of the project. Obviously, of course, there are so many sub moments within the implementation, from the setting up to the actual delivering the actions. But one of the things that we have seen, and COVID has been the emblem of this, is it's very hard to govern the external factors which have an effect on a place-based approach. For instance, a traditional example is gentrification. If you start regenerating a given area, the real estate value will increase. Usually the public administration would have the ambition of creating better conditions for the inhabitants, but external factors, foreign investors or so on, could mean that you start having a gentrification. This is just one of the many examples that we have seen about how it is really important to be able to also work in a more structured and in addressing complexity, because this allows you to identify some of the external factors that might arise. And the last phase is actually also written in the longest way, which is everything that comes at the end of the project. So it's the evaluation of the actions that obviously comes from a monitoring throughout the activities. It means the transferability to other cities. It means the capitalization of your own actions and the upscaling also within your own city. And here we see that there is, if a project has been really place-based, if they have really developed the project based on the activities that were the response of the given place, well, we see that sometimes it's not so automatic to be able to translate that specificity to a completely different context. It could be in another country, that could be even just in another neighborhood of your own city. And this is something that probably, and again, it's interesting to see that we have also URBACT cities that might have been working on the transfer networks, trying to identify what are the key elements that also allow to be able to, what are the components that are actually replicable in the different contexts. Sharing with you briefly two of the cities that have actually, and the slides go a bit on their own. Let's see if I manage to. Yeah, I'm sorry, for me, WebEx and I don't really get along too well, so I would maybe ask, yes, I think if I could ask Lucia's magical support, because I think otherwise you will end up seeing slides of some other presentation or something in my own hands. Thanks. So Ljubljana has been working on a very interesting project that is working with what might actually sound something like out of a science fiction film, which is invasive alien plant species, which actually are basically all those plants that you often would have been just taking out of your garden. And actually they've been looking into in a circular economy approach, looking into how can you actually not consider these as just waste plants, but actually looking at them as a resource and developing a new business model around it. And there's been a huge work on educational approach and awareness raising and working with different sectors of, for example, creative industries, to start thinking about different uses that could be done out of the plants. So for instance, it could be at home, different activities that you can do, as well as in companies or laboratories and workshops that could be carried out, looking into also what is a local dimension. For instance, how social enterprises or vulnerable groups could be also involved into actually developing new ways of thinking reuse of what would be natural waste somehow. So with the next slide. Thank you. Here you see some of the images, and you see, for instance, the workshops that were done in schools. This was a major activity, and we've seen actually this is a fascinating aspect about how it's really, we realize how important it is if we want to really have long-term change, to be working on education and working especially on school with kids. Throughout the projects, we have seen that has been considered a fundamental element. And we see some of the output. So here in the middle, in the second picture, you see some of these alien plant species. And you see some paper that was made out of it. And this was done exactly with creative industry. They've been doing all sorts of different artistic products that could also go then on the market as new products. And this is particularly relevant because when we're talking, I mean, if we talk about place-based, obviously there's nothing more place-based than a plant with its roots, but especially being able to train people to recognize these plants, look at these plants in a way that are, for instance, with their aesthetic or biological characteristics to be able to be reused, is yet again a different way of looking at the very local dimension and looking into what are not only the physical but also the human resources that can be brought together. So with the next slide, we see, for instance, one of the what I was saying, one of the key elements is targeting the people in the neighborhood or in a given or in given categories, of which students we have seen, I guess maybe you've seen the same thing in your own city, are fundamental in being able to experience the work on the field within, in this case, within the nature that was surrounding them. And this has been also an opportunity for which schools could actually also connect with one another, because this is often also what we see, that it's already difficult within the school to be working together, even harder to be able to, for example, bring schools that are in different neighborhoods or working on different aspects, for example, technical high schools with kindergartens and so on. So the Ljubljana project, out of its whole complexity, and obviously what we share with you here is just a snippet of all the experience, and we can put in the chat the link to the whole project if you want to read more about it. But this is one of the elements that we have found particularly relevant when we're looking into the place-based approach. The next case that I would like to share with you now is going to Italy and going to Prato. Prato is still industrial city, especially in the textile context. And they've been working on, and as many industrial cities, pollution and living conditions, quality of life in the city have been one of the main concerns of the public administration. And one of the things that they've been working on is to develop a forestation plan for the city. And the Urban Innovative Action Project has been a great opportunity for developing nature-based solutions that would look into forestation as a means not only for reducing CO2 emissions, but also reducing inequalities by intervening, for instance, in social housing estates, but also working into new economic models, for instance, working on sustainable food production in food markets. And what is particularly interesting is that the project has been, therefore, targeting different neighborhoods where different elements of this solution could be experimented with a stronger focus. So some neighborhoods, just as I said, were on social housing, but there was forestation on office buildings. There was forestation on the local food market, as well as local schools and so on. And the complexity of the activities that goes around planting plants in a given neighborhood and the interaction that you have with the local inhabitants, given such a different context that you would have in a business center with the employees rather than in a social housing estate with the highly unemployed inhabitants, is completely different. The potential and the relationship that they do create with these plants. And I think it's also a nice emblem, also in this historical moment, that we also see how the place-based solution in both of these projects, a bit by pure chance, is actually represented by the role of plants. And I think in terms also of environmental awareness, I think this is something that we're very happy to share with you. And in the next slide, you see some of the images that show out of the different activities that were carried out. One we think is particularly interesting, also connected to what we were talking about before, about the role of the youth. And in order to be able to change on the long term, the awareness and the involvement of the population, it is fundamental to be able to work with youth. Well, Officina Giovani means youth workshop, youngsters workshop. And it's particularly interesting because here we see the role of interface spaces. By these spaces, what do we mean? This is a place that is an ex-slaughterhouse that was regenerated as a community hub. And what is particularly interesting here is that this is a place that does inclusion of youngsters in all sorts of activities, and they carried out a number of workshops in terms of forestation, and this created a lot of pride also in many of the youngsters that were creating urban jungles in the city, and also being able to see in terms of environmental issues, in terms of social issues, what was the potential of the forestation. And I think this is a particularly relevant element, because we see that if we want to work on place-based approach, we have the people, therefore the youngsters, but we need a place. We need a place to bring these people. And just as we were saying at the beginning of our chat today, it's digital helps us, but physical space helps us even more, because there is more conditions for unexpected interactions, from which innovation and creativity take place. And in the next slide, you see one of the quotes that came out during the interview that really shows how this workshop space created the possibility of having temporary activities that also helped out to everybody to think about new ways and what was the reaction in relation to the forestation actions. And this is something that is fundamental. Many of you in the projects have been maybe experimenting with so-called placemaking. This is particularly relevant because it really helps us to go into the experimentation, which is the core of innovation. We have to also accept that sometimes it might not work, but we need to have space for everybody to take ownership about these projects. And just to sum up some of the things that came out from some initial considerations in terms of place-based approach. In the next slide, we see a bit of an overview that is related to some of the things that we have considered. So, and this is why also I was asking you, what topics are you working on? And I've seen in the meantime, there's been a lot of pop-up comments. So I will, as soon as I finish now my explanation, I will read them and also see if there are also some considerations that might be also related to this. We see that there is in terms of certain disciplines. For instance, if we're talking about urban regeneration, when we're aiming at tackling urban poverty, usually there would be a very strong focus on a place-based approach. This might not be the case when we're looking into projects such as digital transition. So it is particularly relevant for us to be able to also develop guidance, to develop a common understanding and also tools to implement projects that have a place-based approach. Also, when we're looking into fields and we're experimenting into domains that might not necessarily have such a strong, immediate strong connection to a place-based approach. If we believe that it is through a place-based approach that we can actually aim at having a long-term change towards better cities, which should be at least our ambition. A second consideration comes to the fact that just as the Officina Giovani, the workshop for youngsters that I was saying, there is a fundamental aspect that is in relation to the role of interface spaces and interface institutions that are essential to root these projects. Because these places can be a bridge between public, just like you, but also private, but also civic realms, where experimentation can take place. This is why we believe it's so fundamental. And the other last couple of considerations that are on the next slides, which is our last one, so get ready because now we want you to speak a bit more, is also to sum up what we were talking about, the process. When we're talking about the process, we see that there is, just to sum up, the aspect of identifying the right scale. And I think it'd be very interesting also to hear, were some of you challenged in identifying the scale? Or did you have to also modify the scale throughout the project? A second element is how to be able to replicate a project in a different area if you have developed the project upon a place-based approach. And last but not least is the governance of the external factors, because this is something that is fundamental in order to be able that your investment of time, of financial resources, also of passion and creativity doesn't go towards actually sometimes, unfortunately, fostering exactly the opposite of what you were or what you wanted to achieve. And I think in this, the little sad story often in relation to this is projects aiming at tackling urban poverty that create the infrastructure for urban regeneration. I think this is some of the one of the probably the emblems, but I'm sure that many of you have actually been able to develop maybe some counter solutions also to some of the challenges and some of the considerations that we have identified up to now. Anamaria, from my side at this stage, this would be a bit of an overview of what we've been developing together. And I see there have been a lot of comments and questions and conversations going through also the chat. So I'm very happy to see that.
Thank you very much, Dani. This was very insightful, and indeed we had quite some chats with Peter mostly, who was actually challenging a bit this concept of when we look at projects going through these 4 stages that we also have in our study, so co-creation, implementation, evaluation, and then upscaling, and whether this could be reframed a bit in order to understand. So maybe I'll give a bit the floor to Peter to pose his last question, because I think that would be very useful, and it would feed into the experience that you just presented, and also some other experiences that you've seen and can offer a bit more detail. So Peter.
Yeah, hi everybody. I was just wondering about this working out the order of things in my friendly cities in Coventry, Birmingham and Wolverhampton. For example, it now appears, I just did my interview with the 3 cities yesterday for the final report. It now appears that we are capable of talking about upscaling, whereas during the functioning of the project, we weren't at all. So I would say that the reco-design after the project is as important as it was at the beginning. The evaluation process in my friendly cities was an enormous heavy truck which was put on the rails and had to move, and it was changed about halfway through because it was unintelligible to the participants, and it was not giving any information, or it was giving some information, but it was not satisfactory. So this co-design and the redoing of things for me is more like a permanent process. And if we start having rails which are clearly defined and we know we're going the right way, then I think that should give us reflection of, are we actually going in the right way, etc., etc. So I see this much more as an ongoing thing than as a first step. That's all I wanted to say. I'm in an URBACT project doing a transfer with Levente on these partnership agreements, and the same thing is happening. It's a very place-based approach, and that's also a difficult one, especially when the place which you were planning disappears all of a sudden and you have to go to another place. So there is also a danger in the place-based approach of having logics which are very, very strong and which are linked to a place, and then the place moves away for different reasons, and you suddenly find yourself with an emptiness of place. So there are contrasts to what the definitions are which you established. I fully agree that for the purpose of making sense out of projects, you have to do this. But then my comment would be, well, let's try and work outside of project logic with the death at the end, because that is, in my opinion, very destructive.
Thanks, Peter. I think I couldn't agree more on what you're saying. I think when we were mentioning the co-design at the beginning, that's actually related to the application phase, which is officially the only moment in which there is a planned co-design. Usually it lasts 1 month. So with the pressure of the deadline and putting everything, all the admin documents together, so there's not a lot of space for creativity often. And this is one of the things that has come across, is also to be able to, despite then in practice, the UIA Secretariat, most cities have said, all cities have said actually, there's been a lot of flexibility to adjust to the needed change of the project. Also in terms of, all the administrative requirements that come from that. But probably being able to establish moments for retuning the project is not just left to the, to the awareness of the project manager and the partners, but actually having a moment of reassessing this, and on which definitely, as you say, the experts also can have a place. So some of the considerations, I completely agree. And yeah, this is always the challenge of creating categories that on the one hand help you navigate a little bit through complexity, but at the same time you don't want to be too rigid across them, because also we want to be able, I mean, that's the beauty of this program. It's innovative actions. If we become extremely rigid in categories and frame ourselves in a very small courtyard, we won't be able to actually experiment what is needed and also accept the failure, which I think is one of the things that often we, especially as public administrations, there is the biggest struggle on. But absolutely take on board your comments. Thanks a lot.
And I think the failure is linked to a question of trust. if in projects we don't have trust, generally they don't work. And the evaluation or the impact of trust is so complicated to understand and to see. When does it actually click from an untrusting situation to a trusting situation, which makes you go 10 times faster, 10 times better? That's a real key. And for me, it's almost a question of magic. I'm sorry, energy management.
It is, and we actually saw a lot of evidence in all of our hearings on that, because also this fine line between trust and mistrust is sometimes it's very linked to how the project is set up. Because if you feel trapped at some point, stakeholders begin to play a role, and I think it takes a very key understanding that boxes and simplification into concepts is just to, as the word says, is just to be able to simplify the reality, but not it's not necessarily the only reality. I would also like to invite a bit Julia, so we can see more faces, because WebEx is not very good with showing us the variety of participants we have here. So Julia, you have a very interesting question. Maybe you could pose it here for Dani and the rest. Thanks.
Yes, hello everyone. Julia from the JRC Seville. So yes, I was wondering, well, just I think it's important for you to know, which is my background. I'm an architect and an urbanist, and I'm working with the very similar topics you're working with. And I try to understand always a little bit better, what does it mean, this place-based approach? What do we mean when we talk about territorial focus, if those things are the same things or not? And so trying to understand these different perspectives. And then I think that when we're talking at the strategy level, it might not be so urgent to look at how territory is. But when we're talking about projects, well, in that case, we're really zooming in. And so if I do believe that if we think of proposing and helping local and managing authorities to find out which is the best project they can propose, that is most integrated, that is closer to citizens, that is closer to their specific territory, I find it for me almost obvious that space needs to be studied. And it's not something that everybody can do, of course. It's something that can be shared, that can be done collectively. But there are specialists that are trained exactly for this, which are urbanists, geographers, and in general, who works with maps. So I was wondering, from my perspective, it is an entity, a person, a professional, which is crucial to study space, transform it into maps, and make it readable also for non-experts, meaning the community, the local authorities. So I was wondering, is it just myself thinking that this is so crucial, or maybe you found other ways to study space that are not so much related to maps and to a technical perspective, which is the one of the urbanist, for example?
Thank you. Thank you a lot, and also for the introduction. Dani, before I turn to you, maybe I'll just make a brief connection on the fact that in the next principles of the next rounds, we're going to answer exactly that, on how that gets translated, not necessarily mapping related to space, but we're going to talk about different nuances, because this was a bit also our debate inside our team, whether if we start telling the stories and the examples from the UIA project that we surveyed in the three principles, then we would get a bit in the silo of mind that we want to avoid. However, there are pros and cons for this, but hopefully it will link. So Dani, I'm going to turn this, because this might be a good way to introduce what we were discussing, I think, the other day about hybrid spaces, and then that's a good link to our next round. Yeah.
Very briefly, I think, Julia, thanks for raising this issue. If we're talking about place-based, and we said it's about community and about places, there are also skills in being able to manage physical contexts that are fundamental. And I think over the last years, we've seen more and more architects and urban planners. Put your hands up who in the audience is an architect or an urban planner type of thing. I think there are probably many. But we've been shifting more towards also social studies. At the same time, we see also a lot of people coming maybe from sociology and social studies that have been developing skills also in terms of, you know, of physical interventions like urban sociologists and so on. And I think this hybrid figure, regardless of what the studies have been, is the type of facilitator possibly that these processes need. And I think this is a good asset also for what Levente will be talking also about. But I think what you're saying, Julia, is really important, because in order to be able to have this, we need people that have also the skills. It's not automatic that in the public administration, somebody that was hired because of their competencies in legal affairs will be able to facilitate a community process in a given neighborhood. And I think we have to recognize the importance of such skills as well, by either hiring new people in the public administration or being able to, you know, outsource part of the activities by recognizing the necessity of having the adequate skills. So thanks a lot for that. And I think this is a good way also for shifting exactly to the next topic. So I'll leave you off to that, and we can continue chatting in the chat box. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dani. So Levente, over to you a bit to link the place-based approach with the multi-level governance and participation.
Yes, thanks a lot, Anamaria, and thank you, Dani, for the great introduction to the place-based approach. And I'm really thankful to Peter and others for the nice discussion, because it's much more interesting to embed all the things we would like to talk about into this discussion, because this is what is more important, that we can connect to all your experience as well. This is the whole point of this research, to explore all the insider experience of different actors within the UIA projects. So besides place-based approach, of course, one of the key aspects that we were looking at, and that's also one of the key aspects of UIA projects in general, is multi-level governance and participation. This is something that I assume all of you know very much. It's a principle that many of you have been practicing in different kinds of projects, and luckily UIA and URBACT and other more innovative programs are actually requiring kind of multi-level governance and participation approaches. Just to take some words from the new Leipzig Charter's definition, it talks about all levels of urban and spatial policy that should collaborate when addressing complex challenges, with the cooperation of all societal actors, including civil society and the private actors. And as you know, there's been a lot of milestones in terms of policy. The Pact of Amsterdam and the New Urban Agenda were all reinforcing this logic of including different kinds of stakeholders. And when we talk about participation, and this is when my screen should move on, but maybe it doesn't. When we talk about participation and co-creation, and we talked, Peter referred to the question of co-creation. This is something we wanted to also look in this research at how participation actually is enacted, how it is implemented, and what kinds of role co-creation can have in these projects. And as, again, turning to the new Leipzig Charter's definition, the new Leipzig Charter encourages all cities, of course, to engage all urban actors, also strengthening local democracy, as the citizens should have a say in processes that impact their daily lives. And we will come back later why it is very important, actually very key in these projects. But just to give a little bit of a summary on what we were looking into within the projects for an analysis on multi-level governance and participation. We were focusing on the partnership, how partnerships are composed, what are the power relationships between the different actors within the partnerships, what is the continuity of partnerships, for example. And this is also brings us back a little bit to the question of the project logic, if there was something before and after the project, if there's continuity also in the partnerships. Of course, vertical collaboration between a city, metropolitan area, managing authority, sometimes a region, sometimes national authorities, can be very important, although we saw that it's not very often the case that, for example, cities would have very strong relationship with the national authorities, much more with the metropolitan areas and other more intermediate regional authorities. Another focus we had on in the research was to look at how co-design and different kinds of dialogues and discussions lead to implementation, how co-design can be kept on in the implementation and evaluation processes. This is also something we already discussed a little bit in the chat, because effectively co-design can have a continuous part. Many projects we dealt with have a very important feedback loop, very important mechanisms to actually adjust the project according to feedback from the partnership, but also beyond. And also many projects have very detailed and very sophisticated ways of co-designing evaluation and monitoring processes. Of course, we looked at different models or structures of co-governance and co-management, and I will mention a few of these, and different ways to empower and engage citizens. What I would like to focus on now, there's two projects. One is Lyon's Home Silk Road that I had the chance to visit in 2019, still at an earlier stage of the project at the occasion of the Social Housing Festival in Lyon. And this is a project that brings together actually a lot of different actors and a lot of different sectors and aspects. So it is organized around an amazing silk industry heritage building in the city of Villeurbanne, which is the eastern kind of neighboring limitrof town of Lyon. That was designed to host different kinds of housing solutions, temporary housing, but also combining this temporary housing that hosted 30 vulnerable families, also combining this with bringing a lot of cultural events, so opening this up for the whole neighborhood and beyond, so turning this into a place where all kinds of skills and experiences can be shared, and also, developing new work opportunities also for the people hosted and also people, more vulnerable groups from the neighborhood. So again, bringing in the work aspect and also creating an environmentally very conscious and very efficient way of recycling worksite waste. And all this was actually supported and designed through a participatory process that tried to reach, all kinds of segments of society. Now, some highlights that I would like to share about the Home Silk Road project. One thing is about co-design. That's, again, something we discussed already, if there's anything before the project, when this project starts. And it's very interesting in the Lyon project that it was building on already tried experiments, which were, to combine housing and activities, but bringing it to another scale, of course. But also it was building on a failed UIA proposal that already brought together a partnership. So having these partners already around and having already, understood a little bit what does it mean to work together, this actually really allowed the co-design of the proposal of Home Silk Road in a more efficient and more, engaged way. Another aspect I would like to highlight is co-governance and co-governance structure that was created through a very specific legal tool, which is the Société par Action Simplifiée, which was created to involve all partners in a new legal structure that would allow participation and also more balanced power relation between the different actors. We will see also in other projects that this is very important to bring decision-making out of the municipality and create a shared decision-making situation. And also, of course, a very good cooperation between the Grand Lyon metropolitan area and Villeurbanne municipality in terms of, complementary competences when it comes to city planning, social services, etc., etc. And the other aspect, when we talk more about the participation aspect and outreach, that one of the key actors in the process was CCO, a cultural center that already had a big audience, and it could actually open the whole process and all space into towards the whole neighborhoods and bringing a lot of people in and also making the project very, very participated. And also l'atelier permanent, which is like a permanent participation workshop, which created an interface or created a situation or a process that could feed into the process, into the constant, redesign, co-design process, a continuous stream of feedback from all participants and all neighbors who were interested in participation, of course. So some of the highlights that our interviewees mentioned, it's the importance of involving people who don't have the habit to participate in the life of the area. So actually stretching the boundaries of participation, bringing in people who are not the regular, the usual suspects, also allowing a heterogeneity of inhabitants to participate and shape the narrative of this neighborhood, because very often we don't only talk about, of course, physical interventions and social projects, we also talk about changing neighborhoods, and it's very important to be able to create a shared narrative of a neighborhood. And then, of course, the other thing I wanted to mention, another highlight in the quotes is that the SIS, this governance structure that I mentioned before, for many participants, it allowed to believe or think or project a cooperation for longer term projects. It created common work habits and created a more stable and adaptable governance structure for different projects. So again, here we go beyond the project logic. So we create conditions for further collaborations that can be, much longer term projects or a general logic of practically everything that happens in a given neighborhood. The other project I wanted to mention very quickly is DARE in Ravenna, in northeast Italy on the Adriatic coast, which is an urban regeneration project around a former harbor canal area of the city, which is an industrial heritage partly area, but also it's neighboring, or it's partly a low-income, multi-ethnic neighborhood with a lot of challenges. So the project is looking into how to regenerate the area with the participation of inhabitants and with the help of building a digital culture of participation, a digital culture including education and carrying all people of all vulnerable and all kinds of groups with the digital transition, and also creating new kinds of interfaces, new kind of platforms for the participation of citizens. So again, thinking about digital transition, but in a physically embedded way, so relating it to the physical environment, and also in an inclusive way, having very strong participation and educational aspects. And here, some of the key aspects that I would like to highlight is that DARE, in a way, was a continuation of an URBACT project where Ravenna was a partner, which was about cultural and creative industries and building on these cultural and creative industries for urban regeneration. So there was already an existing partnership, which was, of course, extended and updated and upgraded for the UIA partnership. But there was already an existing network of organizations that knew each other, and they could actually build a whole different scale of ambition on this collaboration, and they could effectively co-design the project together. And also the DARE, as you can follow in the journals and articles, built very well detailed and very well structured governance structures with the participation of all partners, like the DARE Redazione, which is kind of an editorial board of the digital platform and communication of DARE and of the Darsena area, which in a way decides together about how to communicate, again, how to shape the narrative of a neighborhood. And the other such governance structure is process organizers team that links all kinds of events and all kinds of participatory processes into an integrated whole in order to shape the future of the neighborhood in an integrated way. And of course, participation has a very strong role in this as well when it comes to all kinds of activities, story labs. This is a photo from a story lab where local residents are telling their stories of the neighborhood and also their relationship with digital tools, for example, which is, of course, for a neighborhood with significant elderly population. This is a very big challenge. All kinds of trainings, role-playing games and walks to involve a broader community. So this is a very important aspect here as well, to not work only with the partnership, but much beyond. So many partners have their own ways to involve very specific target groups, involving elderly population, involving students, involving entrepreneurs, and other vulnerable groups. But also to build, and this is again connecting back to the question of how can we go beyond the project logic, is that the whole project builds on an exploration of a mapping of practices, projects, and policies that already existed in the area. So it's a very interesting mapping, as we also talked about, of different visions, what people imagined, what kind of activities people imagined, and shaping, bringing this together and helping them and their protagonists to come up with proposals, combining these already existing proposals and building on them in order to co-design future scenarios for the area. Yes, and two quick notes, quotes from Ravenna interviewees as well. When many of your cities are already used to participation and participatory processes, but in Ravenna there was this sentiment that with the DARE project, all these processes can be brought to a new level. So it's a new level of co-designing and activating citizens because of the resources, because of the time frame, because of already building on previous projects. But this is something that many projects actually feel that this is a new level for these projects. And also the other thing is when we talk about digital transformation and digital transition, very often the digital domain becomes kind of a goal instead of a tool, and DARE is very careful in using digital tools and digital means as only a means and only a tool for participation and for shaping the future of the neighborhood. So I think this is also very important to remind ourselves every now and then that what are the real objectives and what are the tools that we're using to get there. And just to finish up with a few takeaways, a few key learning elements about multi-level governance and participation. Something that I already mentioned in both projects, we saw this in many other projects, that very often there is a specific momentum that brings partners together towards a shared goal. Sometimes it's an URBACT project, sometimes it's actually, in many cases, it's also a European Capital of Culture season, or a failed application for European Capital of Culture season, or a failed application for UIA. So I think it's also an important message to cities that it's time, if they didn't do it yet, it's time to build strong local networks and strong local partnerships around different topics, because this will make them much stronger also in UIA applications, but also in general in implementing bigger and more strategic urban visions and projects. And also, so besides existing partnerships, it's also important to build on our earlier practices and regions. Sometimes we saw that a partnership that was focusing at some moment on culture and creative industries can be a little bit redirected towards a broader idea of regeneration of a neighborhood. But also some earlier initiatives and ideas and regions can be very important to know about, so that you're not building again from scratch a new project that in a way could overlap with existing projects. So for this, again, the Ravenna case is very important. And the other thing is that what we see is that in many cities, many UIA projects, creating a kind of an organizational structure or an interface that is somewhere between a municipality and other organizations, that is not inside the municipality, maybe somewhere half outside the municipality, that has easier ways to communicate with the other stakeholders, easier ways to make decisions. It can be a very useful vehicle or tool to facilitate this kind of multi-level governance and participation. because as we all know, municipalities can be sometimes slow and bureaucratic, and also it's very much a question of languages and working cultures that should be able to meet in such an interface for cooperation. So it's more or less what I wanted to show, and I'm happy to discuss any questions you would have.
Thank you very much, Levente. I was wondering in the first, in the icebreaker, one of the answers that we had on challenges related to ITD was actually a different readiness level of involving stakeholders. And the example that you offered, both in Lyon and Ravenna, are so rich on building on pre-existing structures and also on failures. And I think that is definitely a key takeaway. But I was wondering also if you could comment or have any examples in mind of what can you do when actually the capacity on the ground is a bit low, on also on how stakeholders could participate in a co-governance arrangement.
I think, I mean, capacity needs to be in the municipality, but also in the other organizations. So it's pretty much about as I just mentioned in the end, about finding a common language, maybe finding, as Dani mentioned, you know, those in-between spaces, those interfaces where different actors can comfortably speak. We did a lot this for example, in Budapest, creating venues which is not the municipality, but not an independent cultural center, something in between that where people can comfortably feel at home and speak. It's also about you know, finding any kind of a pretext to start building local networks. And I think it can be a UIA project, of course, but maybe the order can be different, and maybe having already your local network that can lead to a UIA project is probably much more beneficial. But I think I guess we need a little bit to reform our municipalities. Many municipalities I deal with, there's a lack of, for example, collaboration between different departments, lack of collaboration between you know, municipality and public companies, for example. But also we need to, through trainings and all kinds of interventions, facilitation, we need to create all kinds of ways that situations where municipal officers, you know, private companies, NGOs, knowledge institutions, civic initiatives, they can all, well, private citizens, they can all share their visions and communicate with each other.
And on that note, on facilitation, actually, we have a question from Katalin, whether what's the role of facilitation for the principle that we are discussing here, so for multi-governance and participatory processes, and maybe to link it a bit to what you saw, that whether UIA enabled that, or what was happening in UIA cities related to facilitation, the role of facilitation.
Yes, I think it's some municipalities are very skilled in this, and some municipalities rely on external or semi-external resources. And again, we come back to this in-between structures or these governance structures, which might allow for some external actors or semi-external actors to take the lead of a co-design process, for example, in a partnership or even with citizens. I think in many cities, it's, for example, if we talk about Lyon, it's you know, for example, cultural organizations that have their public, they have their audience, they have their ways of bringing people in a given space or to a given event, that have their own ways of engaging a broader audience, which very often probably much more efficient than if the municipality wants to do that. No, so I think it's pretty much about also exploring the human resources, human capacities around the municipality in these partnerships that would enable, you know, that would maybe give this task or this role to the most appropriate actor in this whole local ecosystem.
Nice, and maybe leave enough space to provoke a bit the imagination on who could be these actors, because I think rarely there is one type of solution. Yeah, very nice suggestion, Dani. So let's see who is in front of the computer. This is a spontaneous icebreaker. We can prepare for a group photo if you want in the middle of the presentation of the event. So we can do a before and after comparison. Yay, humans! So nice. Nice. So Lucia, could I ask you to take a nice print screen of us, a nice photo of us?
Yes. So 3, 2, 1, and we smile.
Of course. And
Okay.
say cheese.
3, 2, 1.
And magic happened, hopefully.
Done.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
On that, I think it actually links with the final part, the final principle. So the cross-sectoral approach that links a lot to both the role of facilitation, but also how do you actually manage to connect policy areas and what is needed in terms of governance. So I'll put back in the presentation mode to hand over to Peter this time. And then hopefully we'll get back a bit to this plenary, which feels much more pleasant. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Anamaria, and morning, everybody. Nice to see you all, even if just for a moment. I'm going to talk about the cross-sectoral approach, which is the third of our principles. But I want to say before we do that, before I go into that, that the three principles are not separate in the sense that there is a huge interrelationship between them. We need to understand that. So you can't talk about place without thinking about the organizations which are in that place and the partnerships, the existing activities that have already been going on there. And in the same way, you can't talk about the partnerships and the multi-levels without thinking about which sectors we're talking about that we're trying to integrate. So everything is connected, but it's useful to look at the principles in their own right. So here we're thinking about the cross-sectoral approach, which is the phrase the JRC uses in its very good handbook on sustainable urban development, where we're trying to overcome the siloed structure of sectorally divided functions, which I think Piotr Wolkowiński mentioned earlier on about how do we transform the local government to be less departmental. And we need these to tackle these multidimensional challenges. So we need coherence in policy-making principles and objectives across policy areas. I'm going to use 2 projects to illustrate this, but I could have chosen any of the 12. So I'm using Cluj Future of Work and the Paris OASIS project. But I see that some of the other ones that I was involved in doing the case study of are in the audience. So a bit of a shout out to Utrecht Plan Einstein and Villa de Cans with Villawatt as well, who are both present. Cluj was trying to do something very interesting on the labour market side, which was to anticipate how the city's labour market needs to adapt and change to adapt to the future of work. How will things change? And they had 3 different lines in their project, and this is just a very quick summary, just so you can understand it. The first is culture, and it goes beyond their Culturepreneurs program, but looks at how to basically build and develop the cultural activity, the cultural organizations in the city. Work 4.0 is looking at how big trends in the labor market, like, for example, automation, will change the skills that the city is based on. And the third is about informal work, and that has a different spatial focus, a different place focus, which is that it targets a particular Roma set of informal encampments, which are in Patarat, and where a particular set of initiatives were financed under the project around improving sanitation, around providing free Wi-Fi, around enabling people to get to work by rerouting a bus service to go close to the camps. Now, it's fair to say that the integration of the informal work is not as well developed into the other two as the other two were with each other. I think we'll go to the next slide now. We have a complex way of controlling the slides. In their co-creation phase, and I think it's important to see that integration starts when you're designing the project. So it starts before you bid. And they did a systematic review of existing good practices in employment issues, and looked, for example, at the Cordis database, which records all the stuff from the Horizon programs. But that produces so many results, you can't actually process them, but it gives you a sense of where things are going. They also looked in detail at what was coming out of URBACT, Interreg, Eurocities, UIA, although it was in its infancy, and the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge. So they were looking at what was happening in cities, not just in Europe, but around the world. I'm just taking over the controls so that... Okay. Just give me a second. In relation to the types of thematics that Cluj was integrating, they were they focused on 4 of the thematic objectives from the last period. Those have now, as it was mentioned in the introduction, those have now been collapsed into just 5 altogether. There are 5 policy objectives in the current programming period, but there were 11 in this period. And so Cluj Future of Work looked at shifts towards low carbon, environment and resource efficiency, social inclusion, policy and discrimination, and education and vocational training. In fact, these were the ones in their Article 7. We seem to have skipped a few slides, but we'll live with that for the moment. The second project is OASIS in Paris, which is if you remember back in, I think it was 2005, there was a major heat wave in France, and thousands of people across the country, and particularly the elderly, died during the heat wave. So climate adaptation and dealing with the heat island effect in cities has always been something that the French have felt very seriously about. The idea of the OASIS is that, starting from the idea that they needed to create cool oases in the city, they took the view that they needed to look for what type of there aren't so many parks in Paris. In fact, Paris is the city of Paris, which sits within the wider banlieue, is the densest urban space in Europe. But they were looking at where they could look for, where could they deliver a sort of cool island effect or an oasis effect. And it turns out that with the 700 schools they have in the city, nearly every Parisian is within 200 meters of a school, which I find extraordinary. They then decided to do a pilot focusing on 10 schools, with now, since the project is just finishing, 60 more are being done, and that's about 10% of the total number of schools in the city. And by transforming school playgrounds or schoolyards, they make them more, they used to all be tarmac, they're converting them to be more permeable with new surfaces, more natural surfaces, water features and shade. And the idea is that in the event of a heat wave in perhaps summer 2022, or whenever the next one really comes, there weren't any last year, people will be able to go to these schoolyards and shelter out of the heat, out of their hot apartments. They took a holistic approach to co-creating the strategy, and it started very much from a single sectoral approach, which came from their resilience strategy. As the project developed, and I'll talk in a moment about how this happened, they came to be more concerned with the well-being of children, and obviously the children are the ones who use the playgrounds most because they're there most of the 6 hours a day, they also used their own objectives to try to decide which schools and where in the city they would target. So they had a target that by 2020, all Parisians should be within a 7-minute walk of a cool island. By 2030, they plan to have at least 300 cool islands and routes, and those won't necessarily all be in schools. The 70 that are already in process will be in schools, but other ones are being developed in other types of spaces. And they also have a target of 40% of the city to be permeable green space, which is a big increase on what they have now. So these are just pictures of the cool islands that they've got, or that they've developed. These are two of the schoolyards that you can see, and you see the difference in surfaces compared to plain tarmac and football, which would have been the dominant form earlier. And just a little note: most schoolyards are slightly dominated by boys playing football, and this well-being aspect enabled a more gender equal approach to schoolyards to take place. So how do you guarantee it? The first thing about the Paris project is that they had a very tight partnership between different departments in the city and some organizations outside. So, for example, the League and Métiers France and the LEAP Lab at Sciences Po are all outside the city, but they brought together their own departments. So, for example, resilience, education, and architecture, and also these other organizations, the Council of Architecture, etc. So this illustrates what Levente was talking about in the last presentation. And it shows that, in a sense, you can't achieve integration of sectorally across sectors unless you build a partnership that includes those sectors. Here are more schoolyards, and you can see much more greenery. It'd be nice to have before and after, but we only have here the after effects. But you see that, and porosity, because even the gravel is porous compared to tarmac that was there before. So again, here, close links to Article 7, 4 different thematic objectives of that period, and also links to the Ile-de-France. And I just, in fact, today received from a friend of mine some photos of a schoolyard in St. Cloud, which is outside the municipal boundary of Paris. And the fact that the schoolyards are developed within the city, the 10 that have already in the pilot, has led to other municipalities in the surrounding periphery of Paris taking it on. And beyond that, there are 200 municipalities across France who are directly engaged with the OASIS project in trying to learn from their experience and do similar things in their own schoolyards. But here you see the range of policies, so social inclusion, environment, climate change adaptation, and education being the core policy fields. Just a couple of challenges they've had to face. For Cluj, where we skipped a couple of slides, and apologies for that. One of the differences has been a sort of difference in, I suppose, organizational culture between a municipality used to doing its things in its own own way. I think Levente said that municipalities tended to be bureaucratic, and that's part of their DNA. They can't help that. But the CCC is the Cluj Cultural Centre, which was lighter, fleeter of foot, able to bring innovation into the city in a faster and perhaps more agile way. And that combination, because you need accountability, you need rules and ways when you're spending public money. But this, I think, but it was also a challenge for them to address these different organizational cultures. And I think I already mentioned, it's not always easy to link very different parts of a project together. And I think there's a closer alignment between the first two parts, the part focusing on the on culture and the part focusing on work 4.0 than there is with the third part, which is focusing on informal work at a particular Roma encampment. For Paris Oasis, I think delivering the project during COVID hasn't been easy. I'm sure it hasn't been easy for any of the UIA projects. And also keeping their service departments on site. Most municipalities, especially if they're doing direct works or something, those departments have a particular culture, and it's not so easy always to be looking at that. I've just seen a note from Marceline saying that Paris Saint-Gervais is also looking into this, and I know that Saint-Denis is trying to replicate what's happening in the so the municipality of Saint-Denis is trying to replicate. So, whoops, the arrows on WebEx are a pain in the butt, but I'm having to live with them. Okay, so some takeaways from this. Firstly, the connection between the nature of the partnership and the nature of the integration. It's much more likely that you can achieve an integration across sectors if you bring people from those sectors into the partnership. So that's an absolute, so it illustrates the connection between them. And you see that in both Paris and Cluj. That integration needs to be thought through in the co-design phase when you're designing your project at the very outset. But it can also be increased in a stepwise progression. And although I skipped a slide, the Paris brought in, Anne Hidalgo, the mayor, brought in the notion of the 15-minute city, which was one of her really flagship new policies. The idea that many services should be available within 15 minutes of the user. And in they then scouted around for which policies could be used to actually make this work, and one of the policies was Paris Oasis. So I think the idea that you don't necessarily start with a full deck of cards in relation to integration, you might add things on the way, but it's best to start with a clear outlook on what you need to integrate to begin with. And I think the other thing which Paris illustrates very well is the need to have very clear and tangible targets for each of the policy objectives. There is a wider question about how you measure the added value of integration, which I won't touch on here. That's perhaps for another session. But the fact that they already had the idea that they would that everywhere should be within 7 minutes of a cool oasis meant that this also influenced which schoolyards should be chosen both in the pilot and in the next 60 that they're doing under their own funds. So having very clear objectives for each of those policies that you are integrating in a cross-sectoral approach is very important. I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Maybe I'll invite a bit the other Peter in the spotlight to pose, because he had quite a meta question, but I think it's quite relevant, and it links a bit to how you translated and you brought evidence from the two projects from Cluj and Paris on how they structured the project in order to allow a cross-sectoral approach. which was not necessarily obvious all the times, or delivering a cross-sectoral approach all the times, but in the end managing to do that. So Peter.
I was just commenting on the fact that I think all these three approaches are very, very fundamental, and I think they're justified, etc. But in my friendly cities, Coventry, Wolverhampton, and Birmingham, we found that people who were the beneficiaries, in other words, the migrants, actually became the protagonists. And at the moment, in the scaling up of the project, post-project, have become the main actors. For example, in terms of defense of migrant workers, which is done by one of the migrants through an organization, etc. It's also done by an association of social initiatives which were taken on, and they have been mutualizing their competencies and going forward. So I think there's another way of looking at a project from the point of view of what was said previously, I think by Kathleen Colossa, that how do we actually observe the participation question and the final beneficiary usage value, because in that project it has become particularly relevant. For example, achieving contact with different communities through health champions as regards to the COVID situation. So that was just my point, that it's another approach to understanding and seeing what's going on.
If I can, I'll bring in Levente in a moment, but if I can just start that one. I think there is always a danger with more technocratic partnership approaches, that the real end users are not directly empowered and participate. And you often see intermediate end users as the main actors. If you took the Paris project, the children were involved in co-design processes, but they in no way managed the project. I mean, it's a construction project, and you can't easily let children be too much involved in that part of it. I once did try, but it wasn't a total success. But in other projects, we are looking at deep empowerment as a construct, and particularly under Levente's theme. So I'll just hand over to him and see if he has any comments about what you're saying.
Yes, I was thinking of commenting on Peter's written comment also. So I think one part of co-governance and co-management is giving up power, and exactly to allow new protagonists to grow up and grow out and develop new roles. So I think, of course, this is the most difficult thing for a municipality or any other organization to give up power or to share power. But this is, I think, a process that could lead to what you suggest. And also another perspective I would like to add is the question of resilience and robustness, because the more power is shared and the more different kinds of protagonists, like those volunteers or people that you mentioned, are empowered, the more flexible an organization or a system is, and the better it can respond to different kinds of challenges. We saw in COVID, we saw now with the refugee crisis, we saw in every, we saw at the economic crisis of 2008, 13, that the kinds of co-governed spaces, the spaces that are half out there, but still enjoy some kind of support or facilitation by the municipality, the organizations that rely on different kinds of knowledges and experiences, they are the fastest to react. So this is actually a very important dimension in all our cities, and I don't think there is a contradiction in what you suggest, Peter, as an important role, an important personal development, and the topics we bring up.
I think that's a very good point that will, for sure, can be elaborated many times, but I think it's something that we definitely have to speak more and give examples from practice, because I think this is sometimes in a lot of conversations what is missing. And for this, in order to a bit understand on what we should focus, because as you saw from Dani's, Levente's, and Peter's short summaries, this was just a short summary of only some takeaways, some key learnings from only 6 projects of the 12 surveyed one, which are very rich, and they can tell many stories, and for our study's sake, we want to focus on the study of integrated territorial approach. However, they have amazing stories of bringing change, of resiliency, of impact in their community. So it's quite a privilege to know that. So I will move a bit to introduce we have 5 questions prepared. But before that, Peter, do you want to add anything?
I did just want to make a quick comment. Harris Biskos has got a question about what are the key skills or competences required to coordinate a cross-sectoral and participative approach in implementation. And I think this is a really important question because not every municipality is fully able. Obviously, you have between maybe several hundred workers in a city to several thousand workers in a city, and you can't change them quickly. So you need to work with what the skills base you have and try and improve it. I recall an URBACT project which was on sustainable food, where in Amersfoort in the Netherlands, where the mayor at the beginning of the year in his speech to his 120 employees, I think it was, said he wanted them to become free range. He wanted them to go out into the city and really listen to what people wanted from their services and from the municipality. That's a very, very difficult thing for public officials to do. And I think the European Commission could play a stronger role, perhaps through the new European Urban Initiative, in explaining and showing and training and developing those capacities in cities to do this sort of forms of deep participation and empowerment work. Just in passing, in the Cluj project, they used a form of participative budgeting in the most difficult site in the city, which is this Roma camp, to try and identify priorities about what people really wanted to see in relation to informal work. And that's how they came up with the 3 initiatives that actually happened, and which were around sanitation, Wi-Fi and mobility. And I think the fact that it's possible in that type of environment shows, you sometimes hear the idea that this technique might work in the Netherlands, but we couldn't possibly use it here. And I think that illustrates that perhaps these techniques are more robust than we think. I'll hand back to Anamaria, otherwise we won't have time to do the Slido, but thank you.
No, I love the point, and I think also Harry's question is very, very relevant towards capacity and how much do we imagine this capacity sometimes inside municipality or outside municipality. And I think that's an overarching trend in what we are offering now as emerging evidence from most projects. We're reaching a bit the final stage of our event. So we're going to do 2 blitz surveys. The first one, you're going to have 5 questions, one after another, which are going to mainly just help us get a temperature check on which details should be much more zoomed in our future presentation, of course, in writing, in the case studies and in the final report. So whether it would make sense to have much more details on the co-creation phase, on how the project emerged and integrated the principles that make out the integrated territorial development. It would also be relevant given the fact that we are in a peer community in this call, and you know quite well what was already published both in the UIA Knowledge Hub by URBACT and GRC and so on, whether we should specifically focus on certain topics in the study. It's quite a good timing because we're just in the early phase of drafting that, so that would be very useful for us. So you should have by now the Slido appearing, and you just take the question one by one. The first one are sort of asking you to silo a bit your thinking. So it's a sort of, as I said, temperature check just to get a sense of what would be most interesting. So whether it would be to understand more what happened in the co-creation phase in projects, whether in implementation or in the evaluation or in the transfer. and you only have one option to make it complicated. And the last two questions are open to actually tell us a bit more about what you would like to learn more about or to see highlighted. And also on the fact, we touched a bit on the challenges in the beginning of the talk, on the fact that sometimes the city and the city ecosystem is the one that knows and has a great ambition of what it needs to do, but it does need the support of regional and national authorities and European authorities. So in a way, what advice would you have to promote such good practices? So for this good thematic content to actually reach policy makers and policy officers. So this is the quick round of 5 questions. And of course, if you have any concerns, you can just unmute and tell us so we can have a normal conversation for WebEx standards. And we can take 3 minutes to do this, to go through the questions. I feel the WebEx, the Slido app is a bit like a teacher, not showing you results until you get all your answers right. So yeah, maybe Kathleen, after we get more answers, you could share the results, because otherwise I only see the answers from one question.
Yes, I can do that. For now, we have 28 people who answered. So we can maybe wait another minute, and then I'll share the results. I think that the first one are easy and quick to answer, but for the last two, because it's free text, it takes a bit more time.
Definitely.
So if we go to the first question, which was on the place-based approach, the co-design phase is the phase where people are the most interested in. We've got 32% who said that, closely followed by upscaling, transfer, and sustainability. Regarding to the second question, which is on multi-level governance and participatory approaches, this one is really close between the co-design and the implementation. 40% for co-design, 43% for the implementation. And as Donald pointed out, only 3% are interested in the evaluation phase for everything related to multi-governance and participation. Regarding cross-sectoral integration, quite similar, very close between the co-design and the implementation phase, with 42% and 36%. And little for evaluation, 8%, a bit more for upscaling and transfer. But now implementation is going up because we're receiving more votes, so the gap is narrowing.
And Nina, I think, mentioned that she couldn't answer, so we might have some technical glitches. So let us know a bit in chat your answer, and we can comment. But this is just to get a check on the proportion. But it's quite clear from the first three that co-design and implementation are much more phases. Let's say, are more interesting. It might be also because there was a very good study on evaluation and monitoring practices in UIA projects already done. So that might, I don't know, I'm just guessing. So let me know if this is why you answered like this. And Nina, yes, was into upscaling and transfer. And indeed, Plan Einstein really has a story to tell also on how important it would have been to integrate some transfer thinking from the beginning somehow. Okay, moving slowly, but
so do you want me to quickly go through question 4 and 5?
Yeah, sure, thanks.
So a lot of comments, and it's difficult to read them all, but we've got practical guidelines for policy decision makers as something that people would like to see highlighted. Questions on the management of stakeholders beyond the partnership. How to measure social impact during the implementation. The specific advantages and difficulties linked to the size of the city and the type of the city, so metropolitan, rural, declining, growing. The links between the principles, users and citizens' perspectives. So a lot of good ideas to focus on. Again, this question of the capacity building is coming back. So yeah, a lot of food for thoughts for the drafting of the report. And for the final question on how to promote these good practices to managing authorities and national ministries, we've got short trainings, recommendations, bringing them to the discussion of EU program events. I've seen that the commission was present today's event. Let's see what they heard about it. It's difficult for cities to reach managing authorities and national policymakers. Perhaps some requirements to managing authorities in the operational program about consulting with their cities regularly would help. So that's a really good point. Involve them at the beginning of the process design. That's true, also a very good idea. Showcase events, national relays. So yeah, lots of also very convincing input on how we can promote the findings of the study and the added value of this integrated approach to other vertical stakeholders.
Thank you. It's very useful for us, and it's just the beginning of the iceberg in terms of a temperature check. Because we're running a bit late, we have 5 more minutes to go. So I won't comment extensively, but thank you for the notes. We now have 2 things. Again, we have a round of 5 questions. They are just a multiple choice, so it should go fast. So we can launch this a bit. It's just to get a sense of what happened to you in the last 2 hours. And hopefully, maybe I can move the slide to, okay, perfect. Yeah, so please also use the browser in case it doesn't appear on the WebEx platform. And I'm going just to briefly comment on next steps. So as I mentioned in the beginning of our session today, we are now we just finalized 12 hearings, and we're going to be working on, firstly, on case studies, which are going to be more of a narrative account, more briefly focusing on a particular aspect of each project. So as there was a comment earlier, like Matsukato said, storytellers rule the world. Hopefully this is going to be the digestible version of the study. And then we will be working on the final report, taking into account, and thank you very much for the suggestions that you just gave to us. They should be ready by September, early September. And following that, there are going to be 2 dissemination events. One more focused probably on managing authorities to make them aware that very valuable experience is coming out from cities who had the courage to really innovate and take things to a new level, and also a bit to bring more substance to innovation, not the fact that it's not about new things, it's about processes, it's about really making change in a certain local context. So we hope that these messages would also break through. Yeah, and I think this is going to be the sum up of our work this year. So probably everything should be online on the UIA Knowledge Hub repository by end of the year. Let's see how we are with the fast questions.
The polls are coming in, or the votes, sorry, are coming in. And I think people are quite happy with how the session went today. So gives me also the opportunity to thank you, Anamaria and Daniella, Levente, and Peter, and Lucia as well. For
and Lucia, thank you very much.
Yeah, it wouldn't have happened without her. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I just answered. Okay. Great. Yeah, thank you all for spending the morning with us and through going through to 6 different projects, and also having some very good meta questions about this. And yeah, I think we will share the slides at some point, Kathleen, with the participants, and hopefully with also a very nice photo op that we had, and hopefully see you in person next time.